At my daughter Brielle's 6th birthday party, I walked into my parents' kitchen and found her custom $200 strawberry cake shoved face down in the trash can. My sister Chantel stood there fixing her hair and laughed, telling me my daughter was not worth wasting cake on. I picked up my crying child and walked out the front door without shedding a single tear. The next morning, my mother called me sobbing hysterically, begging me to save Chantel's luxury wedding because her dream venue had just canceled out of nowhere. I took a slow sip of my coffee and calmly told her I honestly did not care. Before I explain how I single-handedly dismantled my toxic family's fake empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your peace from the people who share your blood. My name is Carmen and I am 32 years old. Yesterday was supposed to be a day of pure joy for my little girl. Brielle was turning 6 and she had been talking about her princess party for months. I hosted it at my parents' sprawling house in the suburbs because my mother Brenda insisted. She claimed it was the perfect place for a family gathering, but I should have known better. Growing up in a household where appearances meant everything, I was always the outsider. I built my own wealth from the ground up, running a highly successful real estate and premium event management conglomerate. But to my family, I was just a single mother who refused to play their social climbing games. The afternoon sun was streaming through the large windows when I walked into the kitchen to grab a knife to cut the cake. Instead, I found the beautiful pink and gold-tiered masterpiece ruined. Frosting was smeared down the side of the stainless steel trash bin. Sugar pearls scattered across the expensive tile floor. I stared at it, trying to comprehend what I was looking at. Chantel. My 29-year-old sister was standing by the marble island, casually adjusting the neckline of her designer dress in the reflection of her phone screen. She was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. She had recently gotten engaged to Preston Davenport, a white man whose family supposedly came from generational wealth. Ever since the engagement, my mother and sister had turned into monsters, completely obsessed with impressing his relatives. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. Chantel did not even look up from her phone screen. She adjusted a diamond earring and sighed. "I threw it away, Carmen. Preston's parents are arriving in 20 minutes for an impromptu engagement photo shoot. I cannot have a sticky, loud kids' party ruining the aesthetic of the house. We need the living room for photos." "You threw away a 6-year-old's birthday cake," I said, stepping closer. "Her friends are outside waiting to sing to her." She snorted a cruel sound that made my blood boil. "She was not worth wasting cake on anyway. Look at her, she's already getting chubby. A little less sugar will do her good. Besides, you can just take them to a fast food place on your way back to your apartment. The Davenports are old money, and they expect a certain standard when they visit. We are not doing the whole chaotic family thing today." I felt a cold fury wash over me. I stepped right up to my sister, grabbing her phone out of her hand and slamming it face down on the marble counter. Before I could tear into her, the kitchen door swung open and my mother marched in. Brenda was wearing a stiff beige suit, her hair perfectly sprayed into place. She took one look at the tension between us and immediately turned her glare on me. "What are you doing causing drama in my kitchen?" she demanded. "Your golden child just threw your granddaughter's birthday cake in the trash because she wants to take pictures." I snapped, expecting at least a shred of maternal decency from her. Instead, my mother rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "Stop acting so ghetto, Carmen. Preston's family is old money, and they are on their way right now. Do you want to embarrass this black family in front of my future white-in-laws over some sugar and flour? We have worked too hard to build our image in this community. I will not let your loud behavior ruin your sister's chances of marrying into the elite. Grab your kid and go." I looked at the woman who raised me. I saw the desperate social climber who had always viewed me as an embarrassment because I did not care about country club memberships or church politics. I saw the sister who felt entirely comfortable bullying a child just to secure her own vanity. I did not scream. I did not throw things. I turned around and walked out to the backyard. I gathered Brielle into my arms, kissing her forehead as she looked at me with confusion. I told her friend's parents that there had been an emergency and we needed to leave. I strapped my daughter into her car seat, pulling out of that driveway without looking back. As I drove, I looked at Brielle through the rearview mirror and made a silent vow. This is the last time they will ever disrespect my child. The rest of the evening was spent holding my daughter, wiping away her tears and ordering her favorite takeout to our home. I did not shed a single tear myself. The sadness had completely burned away, leaving only a sharp, focused clarity. The next morning, I was sitting at my kitchen island, enjoying the quiet peace of my home. My phone began to vibrate across the counter. It was my mother. I let it ring 3 times before finally answering. "Carmen, you have to help us," Brenda sobbed into the phone, her voice hysterical and completely stripped of yesterday's arrogant pride. "You have to call the manager of the Glass Conservatory right now." The Glass Conservatory was the most exclusive luxury wedding venue in the city. It featured a stunning botanical garden enclosed in crystal-clear architecture. It was also the venue Chantel had been bragging about booking for the past 6 months. "What are you talking about?" I asked, taking a slow sip of my dark roast coffee. "They just sent Chantel an email," my mother wailed, crying so hard she could barely breathe. "They canceled her wedding venue. No explanation, no warning, just a cancellation notice and a refunded deposit. The Davenports are going to be furious. They will cancel the wedding if we do not have this venue. You know people in the event industry, Carmen. You have to use your little connections to fix this." I looked out my window at the morning sun. I thought about the smashed cake. I thought about the word ghetto being thrown at me for defending my child. I thought about Preston's smug family. "Honestly, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly calm, "I simply do not care." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, but it only lasted for a fraction of a second. Then the explosion came. My mother let out a sound that was somewhere between a shriek and a growl. She told me I was out of my mind and that I did not understand the gravity of the situation. "The Davenports are not the kind of people who tolerate inconveniences, Carmen," she yelled into the phone, her voice shrill with panic. "Preston's mother is already questioning if our family is up to their standard. If this wedding does not happen at the Glass Conservatory, they will pull their financial support and the wedding will be ruined. You are going to call whoever you know over there and fix this right now." I leaned against my kitchen counter, tracing the rim of my coffee mug. It was almost funny how predictable she was. Even in a crisis, her first instinct was to command me to use what she called my little event planning connections to save her golden child. She had spent years minimizing my business, telling her friends at church that I just threw parties for a living while Chantel was saving lives. Now she expected the daughter she dismissed to perform a miracle. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice completely steady, "I am not going to beg anyone to fix this. You and Chantel made it very clear yesterday that my daughter and I are an embarrassment to your new high society aesthetic. You can figure this out yourselves." I could hear Chantel crying in the background. My mother's voice turned venomous, dripping with the kind of cruelty she usually reserved for closed doors. "You listen to me, you bitter, jealous girl. You are going to get on the phone and beg the venue manager. I know you know them. Do not ruin this because you are mad that your sister is marrying into old money while you are sitting in some apartment as a single mother. You could not keep a man, and now you want to destroy Chantel's happiness just to drag her down to your level." The words were meant to hurt, but they just bounced off the armor I had spent the last decade building. She really thought I was still that desperate girl begging for her approval. I took a deep breath, letting the satisfaction of this moment wash over me. "I do not need to call the manager, Mom," I said, clearly articulating every word. "I do not need to beg anyone, because I do not just know the people who work at the Glass Conservatory. My LLC bought the entire property 2 years ago. I own the venue, I own the gardens, I own the catering contracts, and I am the one who personally logged into the system and hit cancel at 2 in the morning." The dead silence that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I could actually hear my mother gasping for air, trying to process the fact that the little party planning business she mocked was actually a multi-million-dollar holding company. "You own it," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, I do. And my property will not be hosting a wedding for a woman who throws my 6-year-old child's birthday cake in the trash. The shock quickly morphed into defensive rage. My mother started screaming again, calling me a liar and a fraud. "You are making this up," she yelled. "And even if it is true, how dare you withhold a family asset from your own sister? You owe her this venue, Carmen. We are family. You are just a selfish, miserable woman who resents her sister for actually getting an education and making something of herself." I set my coffee mug down hard on the counter. The mention of Chantel's education was the final straw. "Do not ever talk to me about her education." I fired back, the anger finally bleeding into my voice. "You mean the medical school tuition you and Dad paid for by secretly draining my college savings? You thought I never found out about that. You stole the money Grandma left for my education to pay for Chantel's pageant fees and her pre-med courses. You forced me to take out crippling student loans to start my business while you handed her everything on a silver platter. You sacrificed my future to buy her a better one, and you have the nerve to call me selfish." She tried to stutter out a denial, but the truth was out, and we both knew it. I did not give her a chance to formulate another lie or pull another guilt trip. "The wedding is canceled, Mom," I said coldly. "Find another venue if you can afford one." I tapped the red button on my screen and ended the call, tossing my phone onto the counter. The house was blissfully quiet. I walked into the living room where Brielle was sitting on the rug, happily playing with her new dollhouse. I sat down next to her, wrapping my arms around her small shoulders and kissing her cheek. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free from the toxic shadows of my parents' house. But I knew my mother, and I certainly knew Chantel. They were not the type of people to accept defeat, especially when their precious social status was on the line. They were desperate to prove they belonged in the wealthy white world of the Davenport family. They would not let this go without a fight. I spent the next hour making breakfast for Brielle and checking my business emails. My phone buzzed constantly with texts and missed calls from my parents and sister, but I ignored them all. Let them panic. Let them realize that the daughter they treated like garbage was actually the one holding all the cards. I was just finishing washing the breakfast dishes when a sharp chime echoed through the kitchen. It was the notification from my front gate security system. I wiped my hands on a towel and pulled up the camera feed on my tablet. My gated mansion sits at the end of a private cul-de-sac, a property my family had no idea I owned. They always assumed I rented a nice apartment downtown because I never invited them over. I knew they would just criticize my decor or demand money if they saw how I truly lived. But somehow they had found my address. On the high-definition screen, I saw my mother's luxury SUV parked haphazardly in front of my wrought-iron security gates. Brenda, Chantel, and Preston were standing on the other side of the heavy metal bars. Preston was aggressively pushing the intercom button, his face flushed with irritation. Chantel was pacing back and forth, wiping her eyes carefully to avoid ruining her makeup. My mother was glaring at the camera, her hands planted firmly on her hips. They were banging on the gate, demanding to be let in. The real war was just beginning. I pressed the intercom button and told them I was opening the gate, but they had exactly 5 minutes before I called the local police department. I walked out of my front door and stood on the porch of my home. The morning air was crisp, but the tension radiating from my driveway was thick enough to choke on. The heavy wrought iron gates slowly swung open, and my mother, Chantel, and Preston marched onto my property. They stopped at the base of my steps, looking up at me. I stayed on the top step, intentionally forcing them to look up. Preston stepped forward first, taking charge of the situation. He had that arrogant, relaxed posture that only comes from a lifetime of never being told no by anyone. He put his hands in the pockets of his expensive chinos and gave me a tight, patronizing smile. He was using that calm, condescending white savior tone that men like him reserve for situations where they feel completely intellectually and socially superior. "Listen, Carmen," he said, his voice dripping with false patience and manufactured sympathy. "You are being very aggressive and emotional right now. I understand that people like you tend to let anger cloud their business judgment, but you need to calm down. You are making a huge mistake over a petty family squabble that frankly does not matter. Let me help you out. He pulled a leather-bound checkbook from his inner jacket pocket and clicked a silver pen. He scribbled a number on the paper, tore it out, and held it up toward me like a dog treat. "I am going to write you a check for $10,000. Preston told me, his chest puffed out like he was rescuing a charity case. "We will consider this a premium booking fee to fix this little tantrum of yours. Now reinstate the venue booking and we can all move past your emotional outburst without holding any grudges." I walked down the steps, slowly taking the piece of paper from his outstretched hand. I looked at the $10,000 check. To Preston and my family, this was an astronomical amount of money that should have instantly brought me to my knees in gratitude. I looked at Preston, then at Chantel, who was smirking triumphantly, and then at my mother, who looked relieved that the wealthy white savior had stepped in to fix my unruly behavior. A laugh bubbled up in my chest. It started small, and then grew into a full, cold laugh that echoed across the manicured lawn. I gripped the edges of Preston's check and ripped it cleanly down the middle. I stacked the pieces and ripped them again, letting the shreds flutter down onto the expensive stone walkway right at his feet. Preston's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by sheer confusion. "My venue's daily operating cost is 3 times this amount, Preston," I said, staring dead into his pale eyes. $10,000 does not even cover the weekly landscaping bill for the botanical gardens you were planning to take your photos in. Keep your money and take your microaggressions off my porch before I lose my temper." The silence that followed was absolute. Preston turned bright red, his jaw clenching as he realized his grand gesture meant absolutely nothing to me, and his fake wealth held no power here. That was when Chantel completely lost her mind. She lunged forward, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at my face. "You are ruining my life," she screamed, her voice shrill and unhinged. "You are just a bitter, lonely woman who wants everyone to be as miserable as you are. Preston's family is going to cancel the wedding if we do not have the glass conservatory. They invited politicians and corporate executives to this wedding, Carmen. You are destroying my fairy tale because you are a jealous single mother." My mother pushed past Preston to join in on the attack, her face twisted with rage. "You are a disgrace to this family," Brenda yelled, pointing at the facade of my house. "I do not care how you managed to buy that venue. You are ruining our one chance to elevate our status. The Davenports are giving us a seat at a table we have worked our entire lives to reach, and you are throwing it away because of a stupid cake." I looked at the 3 of them standing on my property, demanding that I sacrifice my dignity so they could continue to play pretend in high society. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and unlocked the screen, holding it up for them to see. "Your 5 minutes are up," I said, my voice ice cold and perfectly steady. "If you do not turn around and walk off my property right now, I am calling the police and having you all trespassed. And believe me, I will make sure the arrest records and the mugshots are public enough for the Davenports' elite friends to see on the evening news." Chantel gasped, stepping back in horror. Preston took a step back as well, his self-preservation instincts finally kicking in. My mother opened her mouth to scream another insult, but she was cut off by the sound of tires screeching onto the driveway. A sleek, black luxury sedan pulled up violently, parking at a sharp angle behind my mother's vehicle. The driver's side door flew open and my father Calvin stepped out. He slammed the door behind him and marched toward us, his face dark with absolute fury. My father was a proud man who lived his entire life maintaining a facade of incredible wealth and unquestionable authority. He had always enabled Chantel's spoiling her while completely ignoring my existence. He pushed his way through the group and stood at the bottom of my stairs, glaring up at me with pure hatred. "You listen to me right now, Carmen," Calvin growled, his voice booming with patriarchal authority that he thought still worked on me. "You are going to call your staff, and you are going to give your sister that venue immediately. If you do not do this, I am pulling the ultimate trigger. I am signing over the deed to your grandfather's estate in Oak Hill completely to Chantel tomorrow morning. You will be cut out of the family will entirely. You will not get a single dime or a single memory from that house. You will be dead to this family forever." My mother crossed her arms, looking deeply triumphant. Chantel wiped a dramatic tear and smirked knowing that Oak Hill was the crown jewel of our family history and supposedly the source of our remaining wealth. They all stood there waiting for the threat of losing my inheritance to break my spirit. They were waiting for me to crumble, drop to my knees, and beg for their forgiveness to save my future. Instead, I looked down at my father and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I did not yell. I did not defend myself. I just smiled, turned around, walked back inside my beautiful house, and quietly locked the heavy front door behind me. I walked away from the heavy oak door, leaving my father shouting on the front porch. His threat about the family will echoed through the grand foyer of my home, but it only made my smile widen. I headed straight down the hallway past the sweeping staircase and entered my home office. It was a sleek, modern room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking my private pool. I sat down at my glass desk and opened my laptop, logging into my private financial dashboard. My father, Calvin, had always used the family legacy to control everyone around him. Growing up, the Oak Hill estate was the ultimate weapon he wielded. It was a sprawling property my grandfather built from the ground up, a symbol of Black excellence in a neighborhood that originally did not want us there. My father treated that house like a kingdom, and he played the generous king, dangling the inheritance over my head whenever I stepped out of line. He thought cutting me out of the will was the ultimate punishment. He thought he still held the keys to the kingdom. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my wealth manager, Marcus. I asked him to pull up the portfolio files for the Oak Hill estate. While I waited for him to access the documents, my mind drifted back to a conversation I overheard 5 years ago. I had stopped by my parents' house to drop off a gift and heard my mother weeping in the study. Chantel had just demanded a brand new luxury vehicle and a designer wardrobe to keep up appearances for her new high society friends. My parents were drowning in credit card debt trying to maintain their rich church family facade. Instead of telling Chantel no, my father went to a predatory lender and took out a massive second mortgage on the Oak Hill estate. They bled my grandfather's legacy dry just to fund my sister's vanity. What my father did not know was that those predatory lenders have incredibly high interest rates and absolute zero mercy. A year ago, Marcus notified me that a block of distressed real estate debt in the Oak Hill area was being auctioned off by a major bank. My parents had quietly defaulted on their second mortgage. They were living in a house that the bank was actively preparing to foreclose on, all while playing the role of wealthy benefactors to the neighborhood. I told Marcus to buy the debt through one of my anonymous holding companies. I paid off the bank's balance and legally acquired the deed to the Oak Hill estate. My parents had absolutely no idea. They thought the bank had just granted them a miraculous grace period because they never received an eviction notice. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the daughter they called a bitter failure was actually their landlord. Marcus confirmed over the phone that the deed was fully registered and secured in my holding company name. I instructed him to draft a very specific legal document. It was not a foreclosure notice or an eviction slip. It was a simple notice of change in management. It formally stated that the property was now under the direct control of my primary LLC and that all future communications regarding the property must go through my corporate office. I arranged for a private legal courier to deliver the thick envelope directly to my father's hands by noon. I wanted him to open it while he was still fuming about my supposed disobedience. I wanted him to see the name of my company printed at the top of the crisp legal letterhead and realize that the kingdom he just threatened to take away from me was already mine. I leaned back in my leather chair, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I was protecting my grandfather's legacy from being squandered by a man who valued appearances over actual stability. I closed my laptop and went to the kitchen to pour myself a fresh glass of water. Just as I was filling my glass, my phone buzzed on the granite counter. It was a text message from Chantel. I usually ignored her messages completely, but the preview caught my eye. She was bragging as usual. She wrote that I was a pathetic loser for canceling the venue and that my petty actions did not matter anyway because Preston's wealthy parents were currently writing a massive check to secure an even more expensive and exclusive location for her wedding. She claimed the Davenports were completely disgusted by my behavior and were stepping in to save the day with their endless old money. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone and frowned. Something about her message simply did not make sense. My mind immediately went back to the confrontation on my front porch just an hour earlier. Preston had tried to hand me a personal check for $10,000 to buy my cooperation, but there was a critical detail I had noticed before I ripped that piece of paper into shreds. I have an eye for financial documents, and I had seen the routing information and the specific account status code printed in the top corner of his checkbook. If Preston's family was so incredibly wealthy, why was he using an account that was clearly flagged for overdraft protection? More importantly, if he had the money to throw around casually, why was he trying to pay me with a standard personal check instead of a certified bank draft, which is the absolute minimum standard for luxury event bookings? I read Chantel's message again. The Davenports are writing a massive check. A sudden realization hit me hard. If Preston was truly an heir to a massive family fortune, his $10,000 check would not have looked like it was attached to a struggling checking account hanging on by a thread. And if his family had so much liquid cash, why were my parents bending over backward to quietly fund the engagement parties and the initial vendor deposits? I placed my water glass heavily on the counter. The Davenports were not who they claimed to be. There was a massive crack in their perfect wealthy facade, and Chantel was too blinded by her own desperate ambition to see it. I knew right then that I needed to find out exactly where the Davenport money was actually coming from. I walked away from the heavy front door, listening to the muffled sounds of my father shouting on the porch. His threat about cutting me out of the family will echoed in my mind, but it only made my smile widen. I headed straight down the hallway past the sweeping staircase and entered my home office. It was a sleek, quiet room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and logged into my private financial dashboard. My father, Calvin, had always used the family legacy to control everyone around him. Growing up, the Oak Hill estate was the ultimate weapon he wielded against us. It was a sprawling property my grandfather built from the ground up, a symbol of our family's excellence and standing in the community. My grandfather worked 3 jobs to buy that land and build that wraparound porch. But my father treated that house like a personal country club. He played the generous king, dangling the inheritance over my head whenever I stepped out of line or questioned his authority. He thought cutting me out of the will was the ultimate punishment. He truly believed he still held the keys to the kingdom. I picked up my phone and called my wealth manager, Marcus. I asked him to pull up the portfolio files for the Oak Hill estate. While I waited for him to access the documents, my mind drifted back to a secret I had uncovered years ago. 5 years ago, my parents were secretly drowning in debt. They were desperate to maintain their facade as the wealthy pillars of our church community. Chantel had just graduated, and she demanded a brand new luxury vehicle and an entire designer wardrobe to keep up appearances for her new high society friends. Instead of telling her no, my parents went behind my back and took out a massive predatory second mortgage on the Oak Hill estate. They bled my grandfather's legacy dry just to fund my sister's vanity and their own arrogant pride. They showed up to Sunday service in leased luxury cars while hiding past due notices in their desk drawers. What my father did not know was that those predatory lenders have incredibly high interest rates and absolutely zero mercy. A year ago, Marcus had notified me that a block of distressed real estate debt in the Oak Hill area was being auctioned off by a major bank. My parents had quietly defaulted on their second mortgage. They were living in a house that the bank was actively preparing to foreclose on, all while continuing to play the role of wealthy benefactors to the neighborhood. I had told Marcus to buy the debt through one of my anonymous holding companies. I paid off the bank's balance and legally acquired the deed to the Oak Hill estate. My parents had absolutely no idea. They thought the bank had just granted them a miraculous grace period because they never received an official eviction notice. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the daughter they called a bitter failure was actually their landlord. I owned the roof over their heads and the ground they walked on. Marcus confirmed over the phone that the deed was fully registered and secured in my holding company name. I instructed him to draft a very specific legal document. It was not a foreclosure notice or an eviction slip. It was a simple notice of change in management. It formally stated that the property was now under the direct control of my primary corporate office and that all future communications regarding the property must go through my legal team. I arranged for a private legal courier to deliver the thick envelope directly to my parents' house by noon. I wanted my father to open it while he was still fuming about my supposed disobedience. I wanted him to see the name of my company printed at the top of the crisp legal letterhead and realize that the kingdom he just threatened to take away from me was already mine. I leaned back in my leather chair, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I was protecting my grandfather's legacy from being squandered by a man who valued appearances over actual stability. I closed my laptop and went to the kitchen to pour myself a fresh glass of water. Just as I was filling my glass, my phone buzzed on the granite counter. It was a text message from Chantel. I usually ignored her messages completely, but the preview caught my eye. She was bragging as usual. She wrote that I was a pathetic loser for canceling the venue, and that my petty actions did not matter anyway. She claimed Preston's wealthy parents were currently writing a massive check to secure an even more expensive and exclusive location for her wedding. She said the Davenports were completely disgusted by my behavior and were stepping in to save the day with their endless old money. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone and frowned. Something about her message simply did not make sense. My mind immediately went back to the confrontation on my front porch just an hour earlier. Preston had tried to hand me a personal check for $10,000 to buy my cooperation, but there was a critical detail I had noticed before I ripped that piece of paper into shreds. I have a trained eye for financial documents, and I had seen the routing information and the specific account status code printed in the top corner of his checkbook. If Preston's family was so incredibly wealthy, he would not be using an account that was clearly flagged for overdraft protection. More importantly, if he had the money to throw around casually, his check would not be drawing from an account with a restricted status. The piece of paper he tried to hand me on my porch would have bounced the second I tried to cash it. I read Chantel's message again. She was so confident that Preston's parents were paying for a new venue. A sudden realization hit me hard. If Preston was truly an heir to a massive family fortune, his $10,000 check would not have been attached to a struggling checking account hanging on by a thread. And if his family had so much liquid cash, my parents would not have needed to bend over backward to quietly fund the engagement parties and the initial vendor deposits. I placed my water glass heavily on the counter. The Davenports were not who they claimed to be. There was a massive crack in their perfect wealthy facade, and Chantel was too blinded by her own desperate ambition to see it. I knew right then that I needed to find out exactly where the Davenport money was actually coming from. I needed to find out exactly where the Davenport money was actually coming from. I turned away from the front door, leaving my family shouting useless threats on my porch. The heavy wooden door blocked out the sound of my father's rage, but his words about the family will still echoed in my mind. He thought he possessed the ultimate leverage. He thought the Oak Hill estate was his impenetrable fortress, and that threatening to cut me out of the legacy would force me into submission. I walked down the long hallway of my home, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor until I reached my private home office. It was a quiet, minimalist space with massive windows that looked out over the private lake behind my property. I sat down at my glass desk and opened my laptop, logging directly into my highly secured financial dashboard. My father, Calvin, had always used the family legacy to control everyone in his orbit. Growing up, the Oak Hill estate was not just a house, it was the central pillar of our family identity. It was a sprawling, historic property that my grandfather had purchased and painstakingly restored. My father treated that estate like his own personal kingdom. He loved to play the generous monarch, dangling the promise of inheritance over my head whenever I questioned his authority or stepped out of line. He truly believed that threatening to strip away my birthright would bring me to my knees. But my father was living an illusion, and his threat only triggered a very specific memory. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my wealth manager, Marcus. I bypassed the usual pleasantries and asked him to pull up the complete portfolio files for the Oak Hill estate immediately. While I waited for him to access the encrypted documents, my mind drifted back to a secret I had uncovered 5 long years ago. I had stopped by my parents' house one afternoon to drop off a birthday gift for Chantel. I walked in unannounced and heard my father pacing in his study while my mother wept on the leather sofa. Chantel had just graduated and was beginning to run with a very wealthy crowd. She had demanded a brand new luxury vehicle, an entire designer wardrobe, and a massive monthly allowance to keep up appearances for her new high society friends. My parents were already drowning in hidden credit card debt, trying desperately to maintain their rich church family facade. Instead of telling their golden child no, my father did the unthinkable. He went to a predatory private lender and took out a massive second mortgage against the Oak Hill estate. They literally bled my grandfather's legacy dry just to fund my sister's vanity and protect their arrogant pride. What Calvin and Brenda did not understand was that predatory lenders operate with incredibly high interest rates and absolutely zero mercy. A little over a year ago, Marcus had flagged a highly confidential financial report for my review. A block of distressed real estate debt in the Oak Hill area was being auctioned off by a major banking institution. My parents had completely tapped out their resources and had quietly defaulted on their second mortgage. They were living in a historic mansion that the bank was actively preparing to foreclose on, all while they continued to stand at the church pulpit, playing the role of wealthy benefactors to the neighborhood. I had instructed Marcus to buy that bad debt immediately through one of my anonymous holding companies. I paid off the bank's entire balance in cash and legally acquired the deed to the Oak Hill estate. My parents had absolutely no idea. They thought the bank had just granted them some miraculous indefinite grace period because they never received an official eviction notice. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the daughter they mocked as a bitter failure was actually their landlord. I owned the roof over their heads and the ground they walked on. Marcus confirmed over the phone that the deed was still fully secured under my primary corporate umbrella. I instructed him to draft a very specific legal document right then and there. It was not a standard foreclosure notice or an aggressive eviction slip. It was a simple, highly professional notice of change in management. The document formally stated that the Oak Hill property was now under the direct operational control of my holding company, and that all future communications regarding the estate must be routed exclusively through my corporate legal team. I arranged for a private legal courier to deliver the thick envelope directly to my parents' front door by noon. I wanted my father to tear open that envelope while he was still fuming about my supposed disobedience. I wanted him to see the name of my company printed boldly at the top of the crisp legal letterhead. I wanted him to realize that the grand kingdom he had just threatened to take away from me had actually belonged to me for an entire year. I leaned back in my leather chair, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. I was not being malicious. I was protecting my grandfather's hard work from being squandered by a man who valued fake social status over actual generational stability. I thanked Marcus, ended the call, and walked into my kitchen to pour myself a fresh glass of water. Just as I was filling my glass, my phone vibrated intensely against the granite counter. It was a text message from Chantel. I usually ignored her messages completely, but the preview text caught my eye. She was bragging and attempting to rub my face in her supposed victory. She wrote that I was a pathetic loser for canceling the venue, and that my petty actions did not matter anyway. She claimed that Preston's incredibly wealthy parents were currently writing a massive check to secure an even more expensive and exclusive location for her wedding. She said the Davenports were completely disgusted by my ghetto behavior and were stepping in to save the day with their endless old money. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone and frowned deeply. Something about her triumphant message simply did not make logical sense. My mind immediately went back to the confrontation on my front porch just an hour earlier. Preston had stepped forward and tried to hand me a personal check for $10,000 to buy my cooperation. But there was a critical detail my trained eyes had noticed before I ripped that piece of paper into shreds. I have a professional background in finance, and I had clearly seen the routing information and the specific account status code printed in the top corner of his checkbook. If Preston's family was so incredibly wealthy and powerful, he would not be using a standard personal checking account that was clearly flagged with a low-tier overdraft protection code. More importantly, if he had the liquid cash to throw around casually, his check would not have been drawing from an account with a restricted daily limit status. The piece of paper he had tried to hand me on my porch to save his pride would have bounced the second I tried to deposit it. I read Chantel's message again, taking in her absolute confidence that Preston's parents were paying for a brand new premium venue. A sudden cold realization hit me hard. If Preston was truly the heir to a massive family fortune, his $10,000 check would not have been attached to a struggling account hanging on by a thread. And if the Davenport family possessed so much limitless liquid cash, my parents would not have needed to bend over backward, taking on more secret debt to quietly fund the engagement parties and the initial vendor deposits. I placed my water glass heavily on the counter as the pieces of the puzzle began to snap together. The Davenports were not who they claimed to be. There was a massive structural crack in their perfect wealthy facade, and Chantel was too blinded by her own desperate social ambition to see it. I knew right then that I needed to find out exactly where the Davenport money was actually coming from and what kind of fraud my sister was marrying into. I did not waste a single second after that realization. I immediately contacted a private investigator I had used for corporate background checks in the past. I gave him the Davenport name and told him to dig into every single financial record, bank account, and property deed attached to Preston's family. I needed to know exactly why a supposedly wealthy heir was bouncing $10,000 checks from a restricted account. While I waited for the investigator to do his job, Chantel went on the offensive. She started a vicious smear campaign across all her social media platforms. She painted me as a bitter, angry Black woman who was deeply jealous of her successful interracial relationship. My phone started vibrating constantly with direct messages from members of our church. They were flooding my inbox with judgment, telling me I needed to prey on my jealousy and stop trying to ruin my sister's blessing. I did not reply to a single one of them. I stayed completely silent and focused on gathering my ammunition. 2 days later, the private investigator delivered a thick encrypted file to my secure email. I opened the documents and read through the financial summaries. The truth was worse than I had imagined. The Davenports were completely broke. They had a historic name but zero liquid assets. They were drowning in massive debt, and Preston himself had accumulated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal gambling debts. They were entirely relying on Chantel's family to bail them out because they falsely assumed my parents were loaded. They were essentially demanding a dowry to save themselves from financial ruin. As I scrolled deeper into the investigator's file, a specific bank transfer record caught my eye and made my blood run cold. Just 2 weeks ago, my mother Brenda had wired $250,000 directly to Preston's father. I stared at the screen, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. If my parents had defaulted on their mortgage and the Davenports were broke, I needed to know where my mother got $250,000 to wire across the country. My heart started pounding against my ribs. I opened a new tab on my browser and navigated to the portal for our shared family trust accounts. I still had legacy access from my early 20s when my grandmother was alive and teaching me about wealth management. I typed in my old credentials and bypassed the security protocols. The screen loaded, and I clicked on the specific trust fund my late grandmother had set up. I felt all the air leave my lungs. The account was completely empty. It was not my personal fund they had drained. It was the trust fund my grandmother had explicitly established for my 6-year-old daughter Brielle. My parents had stolen from their own innocent grandchild. They took Brielle's entire future to pay a dowry to a broke white family just to secure an illusion of social status for their golden child. The cold calculation I had maintained for days evaporated in an instant. It was replaced by a sheer unadulterated rage that burned hotter than anything I had ever felt in my life. This was no longer just about a ruined birthday cake or a canceled wedding venue. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. This was war, and I was going to destroy their entire world. My phone rang on the desk, breaking the heavy silence in my office. The caller ID showed my mother's name. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain perfectly neutral, and answered the call. Brenda sounded sickeningly sweet on the other end of the line. She told me that our church leader, Pastor Davis, wanted to mediate our little family disagreement. She asked me to meet them for lunch at the local country club the next day so we could all pray and find a path to healing. I told her I would be there. I ended the call and walked over to my printer. I printed every single page of the investigator's file and every bank record showing the stolen trust fund money. I placed the documents into a sleek black folder. The next afternoon, I pulled up to the exclusive country club. I walked through the heavy glass doors and found them sitting at a large table in the private dining room. Brenda, Calvin, Chantel, and Pastor Davis were all waiting for me. I took the only empty seat across from the pastor. Pastor Davis immediately launched into a long, condescending speech. He spoke about the spiritual importance of forgiveness and the absolute necessity of submitting to family authority. He looked at me with pity and told me that holding on to jealousy would only poison my soul. Right on cue, Brenda pulled out a lace handkerchief and began weeping softly, playing the role of the heartbroken victim who just wanted her family back together. I sat there and listened to their pathetic performance without raising my voice or showing a single ounce of emotion. When the pastor finally paused to take a breath, I slowly slid the black folder across the polished wooden table. It stopped right in front of his folded hands. "Pastor," I said, my voice steady and commanding, "since you value family integrity so much, perhaps you should ask my mother why she wired $250,000 of her 6-year-old grandchild's money directly to Preston's father." The color instantly drained from Brenda's face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Calvin dropped his fork and stared at my mother in absolute confusion. He did not know that Brenda had stolen Brielle's trust fund. He looked at the documents and then looked at his wife, demanding to know what I was talking about. He thought she had taken out another desperate loan. He had no idea she had committed felony theft against their own granddaughter. Panic erupted at the table. My father started shouting at my mother right there in the middle of the quiet country club dining room. Brenda was sobbing hysterically, trying to grab the folder, while Chantel screamed that I was a liar. The pastor sat frozen in shock as the perfect wealthy family image shattered into pieces right in front of him. I did not stay to watch the rest of the show. I simply stood up from the table, turned my back on them, and walked out the front doors, leaving them entirely consumed by their own chaotic destruction. I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the country club and stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun. My heels clicked steadily against the pavement as I made my way toward my car. I was eager to get back to Brielle and leave the toxic fumes of that dining room far behind me. Before I could even unlock my car doors, I heard the frantic clicking of stilettos hitting the concrete behind me. "Carmen, wait." Chantel was practically sprinting across the valet drop-off area. Her perfect country club facade was completely abandoned. Her breathing was ragged and her eyes were wild with a frantic kind of panic. She caught my arm, yanking me around to face her. "You are not going to do this," she screamed, her voice cracking loudly enough to make a passing valet turn and stare. "You are not going to walk in there and drop a bomb like that and just leave. You are trying to ruin my fairy tale just because you are miserable." I looked down at her hand, gripping my arm until she slowly let go. I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to give her the screaming match she desperately wanted. "It is not a fairy tale, Chantel," I said calmly. "It is a financial hostage situation, and you are the ransom." But she was not listening to reason. She began pacing back and forth beside my car, tears of genuine panic ruining her expensive makeup. She looked entirely broken. "I need this wedding, Carmen," she blurted out, her voice dropping to a desperate, jagged whisper. "I need to be the one who does everything right. I need to marry into a good family and have the perfect luxury life so everyone can see I am better than you. I am the educated one. I am the successful one. I did everything Mom and Dad asked me to do. I cannot let you win." I stared at my younger sister, feeling a strange mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. She was so hollow inside that her entire self-worth depended on beating me in a twisted competition I had stopped playing a decade ago. "He is broke, Chantel," I told her, keeping my voice low but firm. "The Davenports do not have endless old money. They are drowning in debt, and they are using you and our parents to bail themselves out. They are parasites wearing designer suits. Chantel shook her head wildly, covering her ears like a child refusing to hear it. You are lying, she spat, stepping aggressively into my personal space. You are just making this up because you are a jealous single mother who could not keep a man. You want me to end up alone and struggling just like you, so you do not look like the family failure anymore. I did not flinch at her insult. I had spent years building armor against that exact phrase. Instead, I reminded her of the reality she had been actively ignoring for months. Really, Chantel? I asked, my tone dropping to a sharp whisper. Think about how Preston actually treats you when he thinks no one is listening. Think about how he talks down to you like you are an uneducated child who should be grateful for his attention. Think about his mother making those passive-aggressive comments about your natural hair and constantly asking if our family eats fried chicken at every holiday meal. Chantel swallowed hard, looking away, but I refused to let her escape the truth. You just sit there and smile? I continued pressing the issue. You smile and you take their blatant racism and their constant microaggressions because you are so incredibly desperate for their white validation. You are letting them disrespect our culture, our family, and your own dignity for a man whose bank account is overdrawn. She opened her mouth to scream another desperate denial, but the aggressive sound of a revving engine cut her off. A pristine white BMW pulled sharply into the parking spot right next to us. It was Preston's car, and I knew for a fact it was Elise. He threw the driver's side door open and stepped out looking absolutely furious. He marched right up to us, stepping defensively in front of Chantel like he was protecting his property. I suggest you back off, Carmen, he said, his voice trying hard to sound deep and intimidating. You have caused enough trouble for my fiancée and her family today. Leave us alone before I make things very difficult for you and your little party planning business. I looked Preston up and down, taking in his fake confidence, his leased luxury car, and the arrogant tilt of his chin. He really thought he could intimidate me into silence. I stepped right up to him, closing the distance and refusing to back down an inch. I know about the $250,000, Preston, I said, clearly articulating every single syllable. And I know all about your massive illegal gambling debts. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face instantly. The color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking pale and absolutely terrified. He stood frozen in the country club parking lot, staring at me, as he realized his entire fraudulent world was about to collapse. I did not wait for Preston to formulate a pathetic excuse. I simply turned around and walked to my car, leaving him standing there in the sun, with Chantel still demanding to know what I meant. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and drove away feeling a deep, cold satisfaction. The expression of pure terror on his face was permanently burned into my memory. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my phone was vibrating continuously in the cup holder. It was Preston. He was calling repeatedly, but I let it ring. Then the text messages started flooding in one after another. He was panicking. His fake polished country club persona had completely evaporated, and he was acting like a cornered animal. He offered me a deal. He begged me to keep quiet about the stolen money and his massive gambling debts. He promised he could pay back the $250,000 if I just gave him a little more time to finalize everything. I sat at my kitchen island and replied, asking him exactly how a man with hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal gambling debts planned to suddenly come up with $250,000 in cash. I knew I needed him to put his entire fraudulent scheme into writing. I needed the undeniable proof. His response came through almost immediately. He was so desperate to stop me from exposing him that he abandoned all caution. He told me he just needed to marry Chantel first. He explained that my father, Calvin, was sitting on an absolute gold mine with the Oak Hill estate. Preston typed out his entire master plan in frantic, rambling text messages. He said that once he was officially my father's son-in-law, he was going to convince Calvin to sign over the estate for a massive commercial redevelopment project. He actually believed he was going to manipulate my father and sell my parents' historic house right out from under them the absolute second the ink was dry on the marriage certificate. He thought he was playing the ultimate long game, using my arrogant father as an easy mark to wipe out his dark financial debts. I stared at the glowing screen, reading his detailed written confession over and over again. He had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire operation. I took multiple screenshots of the conversation and safely backed them up to my highly secure cloud server. I strung him along with a vague message saying I would think about his offer just to keep him sweating, and to make sure he did not run away before the big wedding day. Meanwhile, my mother Brenda had fully retreated into her delusional alternate reality. Instead of confronting the devastating fact that she had stolen Brielle's trust fund money and handed it directly to a con artist, she doubled down on her fake high society life. She absolutely refused to face the financial ruin staring her in the face. Just 3 days after the country club disaster, I learned that she had mailed out brand new luxury wedding invitations. She had somehow scrambled to secure a different premium venue, pretending to the entire town that everything was absolutely fine and that our family was richer than ever. I knew she must have taken out another predatory loan or maxed out more hidden credit cards just to keep the lie alive. Later that evening, my cousin forwarded me a screenshot of Brenda's latest social media post. My mother had uploaded a highly filtered picture of Chantel and Preston standing together in front of his leased luxury car. The caption was deliberately designed to shade me publicly. She wrote that she was so incredibly blessed to have a beautiful, successful daughter who brings high-class people into our family instead of bitter negative energy. She was still desperately trying to sell the Davenport lie to everyone in our church and community, because her fragile, arrogant ego simply could not handle the humiliating truth. The very next morning, I walked out to my mailbox and found a thick, cream-colored envelope resting inside. The heavy gold foil lettering on the front matched the new luxury wedding invitations my mother had mailed out. I tore it open right there in my driveway. It was a premium VIP invitation to Chantel and Preston's exclusive rehearsal dinner. Tucked carefully inside the thick cardstock was a small, handwritten note on expensive personalized stationery. I recognized my sister's looping handwriting immediately. She had written, "Come see what a real successful woman looks like. Try not to cry." I stood in the morning sun, holding the arrogant note in my hand. They really thought they had won. They thought they had successfully pushed me out and secured their glorious, wealthy future. They had absolutely no idea that I held the match that was going to burn their entire fake kingdom to the ground. I held the heavy cream-colored envelope in my hand and felt a calm smile spread across my face. I walked back inside my house and placed the arrogant note on my kitchen counter. I was not going to cry, and I was certainly not going to let them win. I was going to accept the invitation and deliver a reality check they would never forget. The next few days were a blur of absolute focus and cold calculation. I channeled every ounce of my corporate event planning expertise, not into designing a beautiful party, but into architecting the perfect execution of justice. I did not waste a single second engaging with my mother's petty social media posts or answering any of the confused text messages from extended family members. My silence was a deliberate strategy. I needed them to feel completely secure in their false victory. I wanted them to walk into that rehearsal dinner believing they had successfully pushed me out of the picture. My first step was to secure the perimeter of my own assets. I met with my corporate attorneys early Tuesday morning to completely finalize the paperwork for the Oak Hill estate. We registered the change of management forms with the county clerk's office, making it a matter of undeniable public record. My holding company was now the undisputed legal owner of the property my parents were currently sleeping in. There were no more loopholes and no more grace periods. I instructed my legal team to draft a formal immediate eviction notice citing the predatory loan default and the transfer of the deed. Once the real estate trap was set, I moved on to the most painful task of the week. I took the thick file my private investigator had compiled and drove straight to the Financial Crimes Division of the local police department. Walking into that precinct was heavy but necessary. I sat down at a metal desk with a fraud detective and laid out every single piece of evidence showing exactly how Brenda had fraudulently accessed the trust accounts. I showed him the wire transfer logs proving she had drained $250,000 of my daughter's money and sent it directly to the Davenport family bank accounts. I filed official reports for grand theft and wire fraud against my own mother. The detective assured me they would be opening a formal investigation immediately and that subpoenas for Brenda's bank records would be issued by the end of the week. Back at my home office, I assembled my materials with clinical precision. I bought several premium black leather presentation folders. Inside the first folder, I placed the county records proving my ownership of the Oak Hill estate, along with the formal eviction notice. Inside the second folder, I placed the bank wire transfers, the trust fund logs, and a copy of the police report I had just filed. The third folder contained all the screenshots of Preston's frantic text messages, where he confessed to his massive illegal gambling debts and detailed his master plan to steal my parents' house once he married Chantel. Every single piece of paper was a nail in the coffin of their fake high society lives. With the legal and logistical preparations fully complete, I closed my laptop and focused on the only thing that truly mattered in my life. I spent Thursday evening entirely offline, giving my full undivided attention to my daughter Brielle. We turned on her favorite upbeat music and transformed the kitchen into our own private messy bakery. We measured flour and cracked eggs, laughing out loud as powdered sugar dusted our noses and covered the dark granite countertops. We baked a beautiful 3-tier vanilla cake and whipped up a massive batch of thick pink buttercream frosting. It was not a perfect professional cake, but it was made with absolute unconditional love and zero stress. As we decorated the top layers with bright, colorful sprinkles, I looked down at my sweet, innocent little girl. I pulled her into a tight hug and breathed in the sweet scent of vanilla in her hair. I made her a silent vow right there in the kitchen. I promised her that no one would ever be allowed to steal her joy or compromise her future ever again. I promised that the toxic people who had tried to build their fake wealth on her back were about to face the ultimate consequences of their greed. Friday evening finally arrived. It was the night of the exclusive Davenport rehearsal dinner. I took my time getting ready, treating the process like I was preparing for the most important corporate board meeting of my entire career. I bypassed the modest conservative dresses I usually wore to family functions to avoid triggering my sister's jealousy. Instead, I pulled out a custom-tailored power red designer suit I had purchased during a business trip to Milan. The tailoring was absolutely immaculate, hugging my frame and projecting pure, undeniable authority. I paired the striking red suit with sleek, nude stilettos and styled my hair in a sharp, flawless cut. I looked in the full-length mirror and saw a woman who commanded respect. I did not look like the bitter single mother my sister claimed I was. I looked exactly like the self-made millionaire I actually was. I walked downstairs and grabbed my heavy leather briefcase containing the 3 folders of evidence. I picked up my car keys and stepped out into the cool evening air, sliding gracefully into the driver's seat of my car. As I started the engine and pulled out of my driveway, I felt completely calm. The waiting was over. The storm was finally here, and I was the one bringing the thunder. The valet opened my car door, and I stepped out onto the polished cobblestone entrance of the Oak Room. It was the most expensive restaurant in the city, known for its private dining suites and exclusive clientele. My heels echoed sharply against the marble floors as the hostess led me toward the private banquet room in the back. As the heavy oak doors swung open, I took in the scene before me. The visual divide in the room was painfully obvious. On the left side sat the Davenport family, blending seamlessly into the dark wood and leather surroundings. They wore understated, muted tones, projecting the quiet arrogance of people who believed they owned the world simply because they were white and carried a legacy last name. On the right side sat my family, trying entirely too hard. My mother, Brenda, was draped in flashy designer logos, wearing a dress that was far too extravagant for a rehearsal dinner. She was desperately attempting to signal wealth to people who were silently judging her every move. The low hum of polite conversation died instantly the absolute second I crossed the threshold. Every single eye in the room turned to look at me. My immaculate power red suit cut through the sea of beige and navy blue like a blaring siren. The silence stretched out, becoming thick and suffocating. Before I could even take 3 steps into the room, Brenda was out of her chair. She marched across the expensive oriental rug, her face flushed with a mixture of panic and rage. She grabbed my arm and pulled me roughly toward the corner, her voice dropping into a desperate, venomous hiss. "What are you doing here, Carmen?" she demanded, her eyes darting nervously back toward the Davenports. "You are going to ruin this. You are going to embarrass us in front of these important people. You were not supposed to actually show up." I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm. I kept my posture perfectly straight, refusing to shrink under her glaring eyes. Before I could formulate a response, Preston's mother, Eleanor Davenport, drifted over. She held a crystal wine glass in her pale hand, looking me up and down with a tight, patronizing smile. Her eyes lingered on my tailored red suit, and her nose wrinkled just slightly. "Well," she said, her tone dripping with polite condescension, "we certainly were not expecting you, Carmen. And that suit is certainly making a statement. Do you not think that shade of red is just a bit too loud for an intimate family dinner? We usually prefer a more refined approach to these gatherings." It was a classic microaggression wrapped in fake country club etiquette. She wanted me to feel loud, aggressive, and out of place. She wanted me to feel like I did not belong in her elevated world. I smiled warmly, meeting her condescending gaze with absolute unblinking confidence. "I was invited, Eleanor," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly modulated. "Chantel sent me a very special VIP invitation herself. And of course I brought a wedding gift." I walked past my sputtering mother and the suddenly rigid Eleanor Davenport. I moved directly to an empty table near the center of the room and placed my heavy black leather briefcase right in the middle of the crisp white tablecloth. The solid thud of the briefcase hitting the wood echoed heavily in the quiet room. Preston was standing near the head table, and the color had completely drained from his face. He recognized the briefcase. He knew exactly what kind of information I was carrying. His eyes darted from me to the briefcase and back again, his chest rising and falling as genuine panic set in. He realized his entire fraudulent life was trapped in that leather bag. Desperate to maintain the illusion and silence me before I could speak, Preston practically lunged for his champagne glass. He grabbed a silver spoon and began clinking it aggressively against the crystal. "Attention, everyone," he said, his voice cracking slightly, before he forced it into a deep, artificial boom. "If I could just have everyone's attention, please." The remaining murmurs in the room died down as the guests turned to look at him. Chantel sat beside him, beaming with foolish pride, completely oblivious to the fact that her perfect groom was sweating through his expensive tailored shirt. "I just want to say how incredibly blessed we are tonight," Preston continued, raising his glass high in the air. "We are here to celebrate love, but we are also here to celebrate the coming together of 2 incredible families. Tomorrow we are blending 2 great wealthy dynasties into one unstoppable legacy. To family and to our prosperous future together." The Davenports and my mother immediately raised their glasses, murmuring polite agreements. But before anyone could take a single sip, I reached over and picked up a crystal water glass from the table. I held it up, catching the light of the chandelier overhead. "Let us talk about that wealth, Preston," I said, my voice ringing out clear and sharp across the silent room. The room remained completely frozen as I set my crystal water glass down next to my heavy leather briefcase. I snapped the twin brass locks open, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent private dining suite. I reached inside and pulled out the first black presentation folder. I did not look at my mother or my sister. I walked straight past the head table and stopped directly in front of Preston's father. He was sitting with his chest puffed out, wearing a bespoke navy suit and looking at me with pure upper-class disdain. I dropped the heavy folder right onto his pristine white dinner plate. "Since we are blending families, we should blend finances," I announced, projecting my voice so every single guest in the room could hear me perfectly. Preston's father scowled and opened the folder. He expected a joke or a petty insult, but what he saw made the color drain completely out of his arrogant face. His tan skin turned ash white in a matter of seconds. Inside that folder were the certified financial statements and bank records I had legally obtained through my private investigator. They showed the undeniable truth about the great Davenport legacy. You see, everyone, I continued, turning to face the divided room. The Davenports love to talk about their old money and their generational wealth. But those bank statements show multiple foreclosures, massive unpaid business loans, and a mountain of crippling debt. They do not have a dynasty, they have a financial black hole, and they are entirely bankrupt. A collective gasp ripped through the room. My aunts and cousins whispered loudly while the Davenport relatives shifted nervously in their seats, refusing to look at each other. Eleanor Davenport gripped the edge of her table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Preston finally snapped. He shoved his chair back violently, sending it crashing to the floor. He marched across the room and stepped aggressively into my personal space, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me into silence. His face was red and a vein bulged visibly in his forehead. "Shut your mouth," he snarled, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. He thought I would shrink away like my mother, or cower like Chantel usually did. He was entirely wrong. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground, holding my designer briefcase, and looked at him with absolute pity. I turned my head away from his red, angry face and looked directly at my sister. Chantel was trembling in her chair, tears welling up in her eyes as her perfect fairy tale crumbled in front of her. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the final thick folder. I walked over to the head table and dropped it right in front of her shaking hands. "These are text messages from your perfect groom Chantel," I said, keeping my voice painfully steady. "I suggest you read them before you walk down the aisle tomorrow. In those messages, he admits to having hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal gambling debts. But more importantly, he explains his brilliant plan to marry you just so he can manipulate our father and steal the Oak Hill estate to pay off his bookies." Chantel stared down at the open folder in front of her. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble so violently that the thick printed pages rattled against the expensive mahogany table. The entire private dining room was so quiet that I could hear her ragged breathing echoing in the heavy silence. Her eyes scanned the printed screenshots, taking in every single word of Preston's arrogant confession. She read the parts where he called our family easy targets, and where he detailed exactly how he was going to manipulate our father into signing away the Oak Hill estate. I watched the illusion shatter completely behind her eyes. The glorious fairy tale she had built her entire identity around was completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. The smug country club life she thought she was marrying into was nothing but a trap designed to use her as a pawn. Preston realized he was losing his grip on his ultimate prize. He lunged forward across the table, trying to snatch the heavy folder away from her shaking hands. His face was slick with sudden sweat, and his voice cracked as he scrambled to formulate a lie to save himself. "Chantel, do not look at that," he pleaded, his hands hovering over the table as he tried to block her view of the papers. "It is fake, Chantel. She made it all up. It is a complete forgery, I swear to you. Carmen is just a jealous, bitter woman who wants to ruin us. She used some computer program to generate those texts because she hates seeing you succeed. You know exactly how she is. She hates that we are happy and she wants to drag you down." Chantel did not look at him. She did not even blink. She just kept staring down at the printed pages, her expensive mascara beginning to run as silent tears spilled down her cheeks and splashed onto the table. She recognized his phone number printed at the top of the screenshots. She recognized his exact phrasing and the specific arrogant details he had shared about their private conversations. She knew in her heart that every single word was real, and the devastating truth was completely paralyzing her. She could not speak or move. She was trapped in the realization that the man she loved was just a parasite waiting to drain her family dry. That was when my mother decided to intervene. Brenda could not stand to watch her precious high society wedding slip through her fingers. She refused to let go of the Davenport name and the fake prestige she craved so desperately. She pushed past her chair so hard it fell backward onto the floor. She marched right up to me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She actually shoved her finger hard against my shoulder, trying to physically push me back toward the heavy oak doors. "You forged this!" Brenda screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the expensive wood-paneled walls. The other patrons in the main restaurant could definitely hear her now, but she was too frantic to care about country club etiquette anymore. She was watching her ultimate social triumph collapse, and she was ready to destroy me to save it. "You are a liar, Carmen," she spat, stepping even closer. "You printed out fake messages just to ruin your sister's perfect life because you cannot stand to see her win. You are doing this because you are a miserable failure. You could not keep your own husband, and you failed at your own marriage, so you want Chantel to end up exactly like you. You want her to be alone and pathetic and struggling. You are nothing but a jealous failure who wants to drag us all down to your level." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the heavy air of the dining room. My aunts and uncles gasped softly at the extreme cruelty in her voice. Some of my cousins shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even Eleanor Davenport took a slight step back, looking visibly disturbed by Brenda's manic screaming. But I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or lose my temper. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me and felt absolutely nothing but cold-focused resolve. I had spent my entire life trying to win her approval, trying to be the good, successful daughter she wanted. And in that single chaotic moment, I realized I was finally completely free of her toxic expectations. I did not need her validation anymore. I only needed justice. "Let us talk about failures, Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm that commanded absolute attention from every single person in the room. I reached back into my heavy black leather briefcase and pulled out the second presentation folder. I held it up high for everyone to see the crisp, dark cover before opening it slowly and deliberately. "Let us talk about what a real failure looks like." I continued, turning my gaze to address the entire room. When my daughter Brielle was born, our grandfather set up a very specific trust fund for her future education and security. He wanted to make sure she was always taken care of, no matter what happened. He appointed you, Brenda, as the primary custodian of that account because he actually trusted you. He believed you would protect your granddaughter's future and keep her money safe. Brenda's face suddenly lost all of its angry color. The aggressive defensive posture vanished in an instant, and she took a stumbling step backward as if she had been physically struck. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. She knew exactly what I was holding in my hands, and she knew there was no way to lie her way out of it. "For the past 6 months, I have been watching you buy designer dresses and book premium luxury venues that I knew for a fact you could never afford," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her. "I knew you and Dad were struggling financially, but suddenly you were spending money like you owned the entire city. So I hired a private investigator to look into the trust fund just to be absolutely sure. And do you know what I found, Mother?" I pulled the certified bank statements from the folder and held them up so the harsh light of the chandelier illuminated the official bank logos and the stamped dates. "I found out that you completely drained your own granddaughter's future," I announced, my voice ringing with undeniable authority, cutting through the heavy silence. "You stole $250,000 from an innocent child, and you did not just steal it, Brenda. You wired every single penny of that money directly into the personal bank accounts of Eleanor and Charles Davenport. You literally bought your way into this fake wealthy family using money that belonged to my daughter." The dining room absolutely exploded. The polite, tense silence was instantly replaced by a deafening roar of shock and outrage. My aunts and uncles jumped out of their seats, pointing at Brenda and shouting in pure disbelief. My cousins were looking at the Davenports with absolute disgust. The carefully constructed wall between the two families completely collapsed into total, unmanageable chaos. Eleanor Davenport turned bright red, covering her face with her hand in utter mortification, while Charles Davenport stared at the floor, entirely humiliated now that their desperate grift was public knowledge. They were supposed to be the rich ones, the elite upper-class family extending their grace to us. But they had been taking handouts stolen from a little girl just to keep their country club memberships active. Through all the shouting and the chaos, I kept my eyes locked on my father. Calvin had been sitting frozen in his chair at the head table, his mind struggling to process the massive scale of the deception. He had spent months bragging to his friends about marrying his daughter off to a prestigious, wealthy family. He had believed every single lie Preston and Brenda had fed him. He had truly thought he was securing his ultimate legacy. Now the absolute truth was staring him right in the face. Preston was a broke con artist who wanted to steal Oak Hill, and Brenda was a thief who had robbed her own blood just to climb a fake social ladder. Calvin slowly stood up. His large, imposing frame seemed to tremble as he looked across the room at his wife. The loud voices of our extended family began to fade into the background as my father stepped forward. He looked at Brenda with an expression of pure, absolute horror. All of his usual arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the devastating realization of what she had actually done. His voice shook when he finally spoke, cutting clearly through the remaining noise of the room. "You stole from our granddaughter, Calvin," asked his voice cracking with a mixture of deep rage and profound heartbreak. Brenda tried to reach out and touch his arm, but Calvin slapped her hand away with a look of pure disgust. He turned away from the woman he had been married to for over 30 years and looked out at the sea of shocked faces in the dining room. He was a man who had built his entire identity on control and appearances, and he was desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of pride he had left. He stood up straighter and puffed out his chest, pulling his expensive suit jacket tight across his broad shoulders. He took a deep breath and tried to summon the old booming authority he always used to intimidate people. "I am the head of this family," Calvin bellowed, his deep voice vibrating through the heavy silence of the room. "I will not let our legacy be destroyed by a foolish mistake. I will fix this immediately. I will sell Oak Hill tomorrow morning, and I will personally pay every single penny of that money back into Brielle's trust fund." He glared at Eleanor and Charles Davenport, who were already edging toward the exit. "The wedding is completely off, but my family will survive this humiliation. I still have my property, and I will handle my own affairs." The extended family members who had just been shouting in outrage suddenly fell quiet again. My aunts and uncles looked at Calvin with a mixture of skepticism and lingering respect. He had always been the patriarch, the one who supposedly held the family fortune. Even in the face of Brenda's massive theft, he was still trying to play the righteous savior. He wanted everyone to believe he was a victim of his wife's greed, but that he was wealthy and powerful enough to make it right. I stared at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel like a secondary citizen in my own home. I looked at the father who had constantly compared me to my sister, who had belittled my career, and who had allowed my mother to treat me like garbage. I listened to him try to play the hero, saving the day with his imaginary wealth. I thought about the countless times he had told me I lacked the business sense to succeed. I thought about the holidays where I was seated at the far end of the table, while Chantel was paraded around like royalty. And then I laughed. It was not a happy sound. It was a cold, echoing laugh that bounced off the mahogany walls and the crystal chandeliers. It sounded alien in the quiet room, cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. Calvin stopped talking and stared at me, his false bravado faltering for just a second. Brenda and Chantel both looked at me like I had completely lost my mind. My Uncle Marcus, who always deferred to Calvin, took a step back, looking genuinely unnerved by the sound of my laughter. "You do not have a property, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly steady calm that carried to the very back of the room. I reached into my black leather briefcase one final time. I pulled out the third and thickest presentation folder. It was heavy with the weight of certified legal documents and irrefutable proof. I walked slowly toward the head table, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. Every eye in the room followed my movement. The entire Davenport family stopped their retreat toward the door, completely captivated by the unfolding disaster. I stopped right in front of my father and dropped the thick stack of papers directly onto the table. He looked down at the documents and his breathing stopped. The very first page was the official recorded deed to the Oak Hill estate. Beneath it were the debt acquisition transfer forms. And beneath those were the final notices of default he had been desperately hiding from the entire family. "You defaulted on your massive loans over a year ago," I explained to the silent room, watching as Calvin's face turned a sickening shade of gray. "You remortgaged the family estate over and over again just to pay for Chantel's ridiculous lavish lifestyle and Brenda's designer clothes. You funded Chantel's failed boutique businesses that never turned a single profit. You paid for luxury vacations to Aspen and Paris, just to maintain the illusion that you were old money. You were completely drowning in debt, and the bank was exactly 3 days away from foreclosing on the only thing you actually cared about. That is impossible, Calvin stammered, his large hands hovering over the paperwork as if touching it would make it real. You cannot have these documents. The bank said they sold the debt to a private holding firm. They said my grace period was extended by the new management. I am the new management, I announced, my voice ringing with total authority. When my private investigator first uncovered the foreclosure notices, I could hardly believe it. The great Calvin, who lectured everyone on fiscal responsibility, was drowning in secret loans. It took me 3 months of intense negotiations through proxy lawyers to buy that debt from the private equity firm. I spent countless nights awake in my office reviewing the contracts, ensuring there was not a single loophole you could use to escape. I made sure the eviction clauses were ironclad. I made sure the vehicle titles were transferred cleanly. I had planned this exact moment for over 100 days, waiting for the perfect audience to witness your downfall. I paid off the bank in full using the money I earned from the tech company you always called a stupid little hobby. I legally transferred the deed into my corporate holding company. I own Oak Hill. I own the land it sits on. I own the luxury cars you drive. You have absolutely nothing left, Calvin. Calvin's hands shook as he finally picked up the official deed. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, searching for a mistake, but there was nothing to find. The paperwork was absolutely flawless. My signature was right there next to the county clerk's stamp. He had been paying rent to his own daughter for the last 6 months without even knowing it. The great patriarch of the family was reduced to a broken shell of a man staring blankly at the papers that proved his entire life was a lie. Brenda let out a pathetic whimpering sound, covering her mouth with both hands, as the reality of their complete financial ruin washed over her. She looked around the beautiful private dining room, realizing she could not afford a single appetizer on the menu, let alone the lavish lifestyle she had been flaunting all evening. Her designer dress suddenly looked like a cheap costume. Chantel just kept crying, staring at the table, unable to process the fact that she was no longer a wealthy heiress. She had lost her fake Prince Charming and her family fortune all in the span of 5 minutes. I stood there looking at the 3 people who had made my life a living hell. They had mocked my ambitions. They had told me I would end up a lonely failure. They had tried to push me out of family photos because my modest dresses did not fit their wealthy aesthetic. All those years I had quietly built my empire, working late nights and sacrificing my social life while they threw lavish parties on credit. I had secured my future and my daughter's future while they actively destroyed theirs. The extended family erupted once again. My Aunt Sheila, who had always been incredibly jealous of Brenda, started laughing out loud. My Uncle Marcus shook his head in absolute disgust and turned his back on my father. The people who had worshipped Calvin for decades were now looking at him like he was a complete fraud. He had no money, and he had no power. He was just an old man sitting in a rented chair in a suit he probably could not afford. Across the room, the Davenports were whispering furiously to each other, gathering their coats, and preparing to flee the scene before they could be associated with our absolute disgrace. Eleanor Davenport was practically running toward the coat check, her face pale with embarrassment. But Preston was not moving. He was standing near the edge of the head table, and I could practically see the gears turning in his head. He had been quietly doing the math ever since I opened my briefcase. His eyes darted from the text messages, exposing his fraud, to the bank statements, exposing Brenda's theft, to the property deed, exposing Calvin's bankruptcy. There was no trust fund left to steal because Brenda had already drained it. There was no Oak Hill estate to manipulate out of Calvin because I was the sole legal owner and I clearly despised him. There was no wealthy family to bail him out of his massive illegal gambling debts. He was completely trapped. He had spent months playing the perfect loving groom, pretending to care about Chantel's tedious stories and tolerating Brenda's obnoxious behavior. He had invested all his remaining time and energy trying to secure his financial rescue, and it had all been for absolutely nothing. There was no payday waiting for him at the end of the aisle. Preston looked at Chantel, who was weeping silently in her chair, her mascara smudged and her perfect hair slightly unraveled. He looked at Calvin, who was staring blankly at the wall, unable to speak. Then he looked at me, standing tall and completely untouchable in my red suit, holding the empty briefcase that had just destroyed his entire world. He knew the game was completely over. He reached up and yanked his expensive silk tie loose. He grabbed his heavy linen napkin and threw it down onto his plate in utter disgust. The handsome, charming facade he had worn for an entire year melted away completely, revealing the desperate, angry parasite underneath. He sneered at my weeping sister, rolling his eyes with absolute contempt as he finally showed his true colors to the entire room. Preston slammed his hands down on the heavy mahogany table and let out a vicious sound that was half laugh and half snarl. The polished country club facade he had worn for the past year evaporated completely, leaving behind nothing but a cornered and furious man. He looked at Chantel, who was still weeping softly in her chair, and his face twisted into a mask of absolute disgust. "You think I actually wanted to marry into this fake ghetto family?" Preston shouted, his voice echoing violently off the expensive paneled walls. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my sister. "Look at yourselves. You walk around draped in designer logos, trying so desperately to prove you belong in our world. You are a complete joke to everyone who actually has money. We laugh at you behind your backs. You people are completely broke and you make me sick." Chantel gasped and covered her mouth as the venomous words struck her like physical blows. Her perfect dream was not just ending, it was turning into a waking nightmare. Preston did not stop there. He turned his rage toward Brenda and Calvin, leaning forward with pure malice in his eyes. "You really thought you outsmarted everyone," Preston continued, pacing like a caged animal. "You thought you could just buy your way into high society with stolen money and leased luxury cars? You are nothing but pathetic social climbers. You are fake. You have absolutely nothing of value to offer anyone, and the second I realized this little charity case was dry, I was going to leave anyway. I would rather be buried in debt than be permanently tied to a family of desperate, pathetic frauds like you." The sheer cruelty of his words finally broke something deep inside my sister. The golden child who had spent her entire life being pampered and protected from reality suddenly snapped. A primal scream tore from Chantel's throat, echoing shrilly through the private dining room. She shoved her chair back so violently it crashed into the wall behind her. Without a single word of warning, Chantel lunged across the distance separating them. She threw herself at Preston with absolute reckless fury. Her hands curled into claws as she swung wildly at his face and chest. Preston stumbled backward in shock as Chantel's manicured nails caught the fabric of his expensive custom suit. She screamed again, tearing at his lapels and slapping at his shoulders. The room erupted into total chaos. The elegant rehearsal dinner dissolved into a frantic physical brawl. Silverware scattered across the floor and crystal wine glasses shattered against the marble tiles as their struggle crashed into a side table. Brenda shrieked in horror, waving her arms wildly and begging someone to intervene, but she was too terrified to step into the fray herself. Calvin tried to move forward to separate them, but his legs seemed to give out beneath him. The great patriarch, who had always commanded absolute authority, was reduced to a weak, trembling old man who could only watch as his youngest daughter lost her mind in front of our entire extended family. I stood perfectly still near the center of the room, holding my empty black leather briefcase, and watched the violent spectacle unfold with cold detachment. I did not lift a finger to help anyone. This was the exact consequence of their lifelong greed, and I was going to let them experience every single agonizing second of it. While Preston and Chantel were locked in their pathetic struggle, I noticed a quiet movement near the head table. Eleanor and Charles Davenport were slowly backing away from the chaos. Preston's parents, the arrogant aristocrats who had looked down their noses at us all evening, were not attempting to help their son. They were not trying to de-escalate the situation or offer any support. They were abandoning him. They saw the mountain of debt, the exposed fraud, and the violent reality of the situation, and they chose absolute cowardice. Charles grabbed Eleanor's arm, and they quietly slipped through the heavy oak doors, fleeing into the main restaurant without looking back. They left their own son behind just to escape the public humiliation of being associated with this disaster. They were rats fleeing a sinking ship, and it was deeply satisfying to witness. Preston finally managed to overpower Chantel. He grabbed both of her arms and shoved her backward with brute force. Chantel lost her footing in her tall designer heels. She twisted awkwardly and collapsed onto the hardwood floor, her expensive silk dress tearing loudly as it caught on the edge of a shattered wine glass. She hit the ground in a pathetic, sobbing heap, her flawless hair ruined and her makeup completely smeared down her face. Preston did not even look down at her. He straightened his torn jacket, running a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. He glared at me one last time, his chest heaving as he realized I had single-handedly dismantled his entire existence. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the private dining room, leaving his weeping fiancée abandoned on the floor of the oak room. The silence that followed Preston's dramatic exit was heavy and suffocating. The only sound in the large room was the ragged, gasping sobs coming from Chantel as she curled into a ball on the floor. The extended family had seen enough. The illusion of the wealthy, successful Wilson family was entirely dead, and the rotting corpse of their reality was too much for anyone to stomach. Aunt Sheila was the first to move. She grabbed her purse from the back of her chair and shook her head in sheer disgust. She looked down at Brenda, who was paralyzed with shock, and let out a harsh scoff before walking out the door. Uncle Marcus followed right behind her. He did not say a single word to Calvin. He did not offer any comfort or any brotherly support. He just looked at my father with profound disappointment and turned his back on him forever. One by one, the rest of the aunts, uncles, and cousins silently stood up and gathered their belongings. They whispered furiously among themselves as they filed out of the room. I could hear their hushed voices floating back toward us. They called Brenda a thief. They called Calvin a fool. They muttered about the absolute disgrace the family had become. They wanted nothing to do with the toxic wreckage that was left behind. Within minutes, the grand private dining suite was completely empty except for the four of us. The tables were covered in uneaten gourmet food and discarded linen napkins. The floor was littered with broken glass and the shredded remains of my sister's dignity. The grand society wedding was dead, and the Wilson legacy was buried right alongside it. I slowly closed the brass locks on my briefcase. The sharp click echoed loudly, causing Calvin to flinch. I turned to walk away, my mission completely accomplished. I had delivered the ultimate reality check, and I was ready to go home to my daughter and leave them in the ruins of their own making. But before I could reach the door, I heard a pathetic scrambling sound behind me. I stopped and turned around. Brenda was on her hands and knees. The woman who had spent my entire life looking down on me was physically crawling across the expensive oriental rug toward my feet. Her flashy designer dress dragged awkwardly along the floor as she moved. Her face was streaked with tears, and her eyes were wide with pure animal desperation. She realized that the banks were gone. The Davenports were gone. The extended family was gone. The only person left in the entire world who had any actual power or money was the daughter she had always treated like garbage. Brenda reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the hem of my tailored red trousers. Her fingers clutched the fabric tightly as she looked up at me from the floor. "Please, Carmen," she wept, her voice cracking into a high, desperate whine. "You have all the money. You own the house. Do not throw us out. We are your family." I looked down at the woman gripping the fabric of my tailored red suit. Brenda was sobbing uncontrollably, her tears staining the expensive rug beneath us. I looked past her to where Chantel was still crumpled on the floor in her ruined silk dress, weeping over the loss of a fake billionaire. I shifted my gaze to Calvin, who remained completely paralyzed by his own shame and the sudden realization that his entire legacy was built on quicksand. They were all broken, and they were all looking to me for mercy. For a brief second, the heavy silence of the room was broken only by my mother's ragged breathing as she repeated that word over and over again. Family. She kept using that word as if it was a magic spell that could instantly erase decades of cruelty. But looking at her begging on the floor, I did not see my mother. I saw the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely invisible. I remembered every single holiday where I was pushed to the background while Chantel was paraded around like a prize. I remembered the endless stream of insults, the times I was called an ugly duckling, a college dropout, and a bitter single mother. But most vividly, I remembered the look on my sweet, innocent daughter's face when she found her beautiful homemade birthday cake shoved into the garbage can just because it did not match my mother's high society aesthetic. Family does not throw a child's birthday cake in the trash, I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. I stepped back, forcing Brenda to release her grip on my trousers. Family does not steal a 6-year-old's future to buy a white man's approval. Brenda collapsed forward, sobbing into her hands, as the absolute reality of her actions finally caught up with her. There was no more escaping the consequences. I looked at the three of them, making sure my words carried the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "You have exactly 30 days to vacate the Oak Hill estate," I announced, letting the words sink into the quiet room. "You will leave the keys on the kitchen counter, and you will not take a single piece of furniture or art that was purchased with the equity of my property. If you are not gone by the end of the month, I will have my private security team physically remove you and your belongings from the premises." Calvin finally found his voice, but it was weak and shaking. "Carmen, please," he begged, taking a small step forward. "Where are we supposed to go? We have absolutely nothing left." "You will have to figure that out, Calvin," I replied smoothly. "Just like I had to figure it out when you both turned your backs on me and told me I was a failure. You have 30 days to find an apartment and learn how the real world works. But that is the absolute least of your problems right now." I turned my attention squarely back to Brenda, who was still trembling on the floor. "The eviction is just business," I continued, my tone hardening into pure ice. "But stealing $250,000 from my daughter's trust fund is a felony. I am pressing criminal charges against you, Brenda. I have already handed over the bank wire transfers, the forged signature documents, and the complete financial ledger to the fraud detectives at the local precinct. They have opened a formal grand theft investigation, and they will be knocking on your door very soon. You are going to prison for what you did to Brielle." The room exploded into a fresh wave of panic. Brenda wailed out loud, a terrible guttural sound of pure terror. She reached for Calvin, but he actually took a step away from her, unable to defend a woman who had doomed them both. Chantel finally pulled herself up from the floor, her ruined dress hanging off her shoulder. Her face was streaked with black makeup and her eyes were wild with fury. She pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You are a monster!" Chantel shrieked, her voice breaking with hysteria. "You are a cold, heartless monster, Carmen. You destroyed my wedding and you destroyed our entire family. You are going to burn in hell for this." I did not yell back. I did not try to explain myself or justify my actions. I simply looked at my sister with a calm, peaceful smile. I had spent my entire life letting them tear me down, and I was finally entirely done. I adjusted the strap of my designer briefcase, making sure my immaculate red suit was perfectly straight. I turned on my heel and walked toward the heavy oak doors. I did not look back at the wreckage behind me. I did not listen to Brenda's desperate sobbing or Chantel's furious screaming as I crossed the threshold and left the private dining suite forever. I walked through the main restaurant, holding my head high, completely ignoring the curious stares of the other patrons. When I pushed through the front doors of the building and stepped out into the cool evening air, I took a deep breath. The night felt incredibly fresh and clean. The heavy burden I had carried for 32 years was finally gone. The valet rushed forward to open the door for me, treating me with the exact kind of respect my family had always tried to deny me. I tipped him generously and slid into the luxurious leather driver's seat of my car. I put the keys in the ignition, and the engine purred to life with the same quiet power I now felt coursing through my own veins. I pulled out of the cobblestone driveway and merged onto the quiet city streets, leaving the oak room and my toxic past fading in the rearview mirror. I drove home knowing that my daughter was safe, knowing that my future was completely secure, and knowing that the storm I had brought down on my toxic family was exactly what they deserved. The illusion was finally over, and I had never felt more alive. The cool night air washed over me as I drove away from the country club, leaving the wreckage of the Wilson family behind me. For the first time in 32 years, my chest did not feel tight with the heavy burden of their toxic expectations. I rolled the windows down, letting the wind tangle my hair as a profound sense of absolute peace settled into my bones. I had finally stopped playing their twisted games, and the silence that followed was beautiful. A few weeks passed, and the reality of the situation crashed down on Brenda and Calvin with brutal, unforgiving force. The grand illusion they had spent decades building evaporated into thin air, leaving them completely exposed to the harsh light of the real world. 30 days after the disastrous rehearsal dinner, my private security team arrived at the Oak Hill estate exactly as I had promised. They stood by the front doors and watched as my parents carried their meager belongings out to a rented moving van. They were not allowed to take any of the expensive furniture or the luxury art pieces because every single item was legally owned by my holding company. They tried to argue, they tried to plead, but the security guards simply handed them the eviction notice and pointed toward the driveway. They were forced to move into a tiny run-down apartment complex on the industrial side of the city. The building smelled like stale cigarette smoke and bleach, a far cry from the manicured lawns and fresh flowers of their previous life. The fraud detectives had not wasted any time building their case against them. Brenda and Calvin were formally indicted on multiple felony charges for the theft of Brielle's trust fund. They had to surrender their passports, and they spent their days meeting with cheap public defenders because they could no longer afford private legal counsel. Every cent they managed to scrape together went toward avoiding prison time, but the evidence was absolutely overwhelming. Their social downfall was even more devastating than their financial ruin. The prestigious megachurch they had attended for 20 years completely shunned them. The pastor who used to invite Calvin to exclusive charity dinners refused to even take their phone calls. The wealthy congregation members who used to compliment Brenda's expensive hats now crossed the street to avoid walking past her. They were absolute pariahs in the community they had once ruled with such arrogance. They had absolutely nothing left but each other and the tiny cramped walls of their depressing new reality. The Davenport family faced an equally spectacular destruction. Preston's desperate house of cards collapsed entirely when the authorities finally caught up with his massive illegal gambling debts. He was arrested at a cheap motel downtown, surrounded by empty liquor bottles and past due notices. The federal investigators charged him with multiple counts of wire fraud, revealing that he had been scamming investors to cover his terrible bets for years. He was marched out in handcuffs, his arrogant smirk replaced by sheer panic as the cameras flashed in his face, catching his absolute disgrace for the evening news. His parents, Charles and Eleanor, filed for total bankruptcy 3 days later. Their country club memberships were revoked, their leased luxury vehicles were repossessed, and their fake high society status was completely obliterated in the local media. They were exposed as the ultimate frauds running a pathetic grift that finally caught up to them. They were forced to flee the city entirely, moving into a tiny retirement community out of state to hide from the massive public shame. But perhaps the most poetic justice belonged to my sister Chantel. The golden child who had never worked a hard day in her entire life suddenly found herself entirely cut off from the bank of mom and dad. Her credit cards were all permanently declined. Her expensive boutique accounts were frozen. Without my father to fund her lavish existence, and without Preston to provide a fake billionaire lifestyle, she was forced to face the real world for the very first time. Chantel had to take a minimum wage job as a waitress at a greasy local diner just to afford her basic living expenses. The girl who used to brag about wearing custom silk dresses from Paris was now forced to wear a stained polyester uniform, smelling constantly of fried food and cheap coffee. She spent her days wiping down sticky tables and taking orders from truck drivers while her feet ached in cheap discount shoes. She had to learn how to mop floors and scrub counters, the very tasks she used to mock other people for doing. The social media mockery was absolutely relentless. The girls she used to belittle online, the bridesmaids she had treated like garbage, the acquaintances she had alienated with her extreme arrogance, they all watched her downfall with pure glee. Her canceled high society wedding became a massive running joke in our hometown. People shared pictures of Preston in handcuffs right next to pictures of Chantel taking out the trash at the diner. She tried to delete all of her social media accounts to hide from the humiliation, but the internet never forgets. She was a living punchline stripped of her fake wealth and left to clean up spills for minimum wage. Sitting in my spacious corner office overlooking the city, I watched the ashes of their fake empire blow away in the wind. The slate was completely wiped clean. The toxic elements that had poisoned my entire life were entirely eradicated. I had reclaimed my power, my dignity, and my property. Oak Hill belonged to me, and my business was thriving more than ever. The people who had tried to break me were now broken themselves entirely by their own greedy hands. I looked down at the silver-framed photograph sitting on my sleek glass desk. It was a picture of my beautiful daughter Brielle smiling brightly, missing her two front teeth. My heart swelled with a fierce protective love that eclipsed all the anger and vengeance of the past month. I had secured her future, and I had eliminated the parasites who tried to steal it from her. I had won the war, and I had protected the only person who actually mattered. But as I looked at her sweet, innocent face, my thoughts drifted back to the terrible night that had started this entire chain of events. I thought about the devastated look in her eyes when she saw her perfect little birthday cake shoved into the garbage can just so my mother could impress her wealthy fake friends. The villains were punished and the empire had fallen and the bad guys were living in the squalor they deserved. But I realized there was still one very important thing left to do. What about the little girl who lost her birthday? Exactly 1 month later, I stood under the towering vaulted glass ceilings of the most exclusive venue in the entire city. The glass conservatory was completely breathtaking, with its panoramic views of the lush botanical gardens and the sparkling city skyline in the far distance. It was the exact location Chantel had desperately tried to book for her fake high society wedding. She had cried and thrown vicious tantrums when she found out there was a 3-year waiting list for normal patrons. But money and genuine professional connections can open doors that pure, arrogant entitlement cannot. I had not rented this magnificent space for a wedding or a stuffy corporate gala. I had rented the entire conservatory to throw a do-over birthday party for a 6-year-old girl. The elegant formal ballroom was completely transformed into a magical over-the-top wonderland. Thousands of shimmering fairy lights were strung across the curved glass ceiling, mimicking a perfect starry night sky. Massive clusters of pastel balloons floated above the tables, and a real vintage indoor carousel was set up right in the middle of the polished dance floor. There were no arrogant socialites or fake wealthy aristocrats sipping expensive champagne and whispering cruel judgments. Instead, the large room was filled with the joyous sounds of children laughing and running freely. My loyal employees from my tech company were there with their families, enjoying the incredible food and the relaxed atmosphere. My genuine friends, who had supported me during my hardest times and believed in my vision, were sitting at the tables smiling and cheering. These were the people who truly loved us and respected us for who we actually were. I stood near the edge of the room just watching my daughter shine in the center of it all. Brielle was wearing a beautiful sparkling princess dress, running from the face-painting station to the carousel with her friends trailing behind her. Her laughter echoed loudly over the upbeat music, filling the massive glass room with pure, unadulterated joy. There was no one here to tell her to be quiet or to stand in the corner. There was no one here to push her out of the way or tell her that her dress was not expensive enough for a family photograph. She was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who adored her and treated her like the bright, wonderful child she was. The upbeat music suddenly shifted to a sweet, familiar melody, and a hush fell over the room as the main event began. The heavy double doors to the catering kitchen swung open, and my heart swelled as I watched the staff wheel out the dessert. It was not just a cake, it was an absolute masterpiece. A massive, 6-tier incredible cake decorated with spun sugar butterflies and delicate edible gold stars, towering almost as tall as Brielle herself. The frosting was a brilliant shade of pink, the exact perfect color of the homemade cake my mother had thrown into the garbage all those months ago. But this cake would never be treated like trash. This cake was the centerpiece of the entire room, a symbol of everything we had overcome and everything we had built. Brielle's eyes went wide with absolute wonder as they wheeled the massive cake right into the center of the dance floor. Her friends gathered around cheering and clapping as the sparkling candles on top were lit, illuminating her face with a warm, beautiful glow. I walked slowly toward her, watching the light reflect in her happy eyes. In that perfect, peaceful moment, I looked around the room at the beautiful life I had built. I realized that my true wealth was not the billions of dollars sitting in my corporate holding accounts or the deeds to massive country estates. My true wealth was the absolute peace of mind I felt right now. My wealth was knowing that my daughter would grow up in a world completely free of the toxic manipulation and cruelty I had endured my entire life. People always say that family is everything and that blood is thicker than water. But I had learned the hard way that toxic bloodlines will only poison your future if you allow them to remain in your life. Cutting off my parents and my sister was not a tragedy at all. It was a complete and total rebirth. I had amputated the diseased parts of my life so that my daughter and I could finally grow and breathe. I had built my own family from scratch, choosing people based on their character, their loyalty and their kindness, rather than their last name or their social status. I had finally broken a terrible generational cycle of abuse, and I had won the only battle that truly mattered in the end. I kneeled down on the polished floor next to Brielle as the catering staff carefully cut the first giant piece of the pink cake. She took the elegant porcelain plate with both hands, a massive, bright smile spreading across her face. She did not take the first bite for herself. Instead, she looked up at me and offered it to me, holding out her little silver fork. I took the bite, and the rich, sweet taste of strawberry and vanilla melted in my mouth. It was without a doubt the sweetest thing I had ever tasted in my entire life. We sat there together on the floor of the beautiful glass conservatory, eating our cake and laughing, completely safe and entirely free from the dark shadows of our past. The greatest lesson from Carmen's journey is that blood does not obligate you to endure abuse, and cutting off toxic family members is not a tragedy, but an act of profound self-love and preservation. True wealth is never defined by country club memberships, luxury cars, or the approval of arrogant relatives. It is found in the absolute peace of mind you create when you build a life surrounded by genuine support. Breaking generational curses requires immense courage, but it allows you to protect your children and write a beautiful new future completely free from the shadows of the past. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering journeys.